To me, I just kind of keep it simple. I definitely think it's bigger than spend. But the basics, when I look at it and say, what basics do you really need to have working? You need data, and in the data, and again, you might be in an organization where you don't have fancy data warehouses and super cool visualization tools, but in order to run procurement, you need access to data. And at the core of that, call it data model or whatever, is the transactions that you've been executing on. Very tactical, but here's the transactions, whether it's invoices paid or purchase orders or whatever you have the easiest access to. Those transactions are connected to suppliers, right? So you can take those transactions and you can slice them by suppliers. Those transactions are billed back to cost centers or departments. So then that gives you this connection back to the stakeholder map that Natasha was talking about. At the most basic level, like, you need those things. So do you have access to the data, and are you paying attention to the data to help drive? I would say that should help drive a strategic mindfulness about the business and not just a tactical, responsive, reactive view to procurement. So visibility, I would kind of say visibility and strategy versus sort of just react and transact.
I mean, I'm curious, from your experience, both of you as CPOs, how common is it for you to know your numbers? For example, your monthly run rate of spend, right? Or is this data sort of forthcoming, or do you always need to go out and get it unless you have a good sort of process in place?
I think most leaders know what their general spend numbers are. Oh, last year we spent, $300 million or $4.5 million. The big slices of the data, I think, are probably tattooed on the back of the eyelids of the leader, particularly at a certain level. But it also just depends. I mean, you start getting to that next level of data, and you're talking to one of these managers in the stakeholder. Somebody asks you a question, what's that takes you that next level down into the data. I think you need to know your data. You need that visibility, because when you go talk to these stakeholders, by the way, your stakeholders don't care about your total spend. They care about your spend, their spend. So, you've got to be able to take this visibility and you've got to translate that into who you're talking to.
Yeah, link it to the stakeholder map.
Yeah. So that it really needs that. It really leads us to a place where we need that visibility.
I'd say with the numbers, not only you know them by heart, you know them the years after. I can quote with the 99% accuracy the number is that we were managing 10 years ago. Just because when you're so involved in it, you can't forget it.
Yeah. No, that's my experience as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of visibility, sometimes you need to get to the right level of it does take efforts to get to the right level of visibility at first.
It does, yeah. And I think it's also an understanding of sort of the financial plumbing in the business. Ultimately, procurement's responsible for certain scope of expenditure, right? But do you know how the money's flowing from an expenses point of view? All the different channels that money goes out, for example, from the business to pay for services and products, and are you bringing that all into the scope? Are you addressing it, strategically, holistically? I think that's also essentially a basic, just understanding what those channels are and
For
where
sure.
people spend. Yeah.
And I think it depends on when you say, do you know where the money goes to? It depends who is you, right? So only very, very high maturity organizations, the finance organization knows exactly where the money goes to, or the extent of it, or they understand the duplication of and redundancy of services that they utilize from the same providers where they pay the same thing, right? It's having 57 contracts with the same hotel chain, right? Or I don't know, take any airline and have 20 different agreements with them, because each company's entity or geographic representation have their own contractual agreement. So it's it is the role of procurement to create this visibility in a very digestible format and say, this is where money goes. And there was not a single time when someone in the room would not say, oh, I had no idea. Not necessarily about how much, but if there's a duplication, if there's an efficiency, if there's redundancy, or how much, for example, is spent on something that historically being considered very small spend, because it's kind of like it's not business critical category, but in reality, even though it doesn't represent the core function of the company, it actually, the spend is quite significant.
Yeah, exactly that. Any other practical ways to kind of improve the visibility? I've got one on my notes. Make sure you're segmenting your suppliers. I know supplier visibility is key, but it's not just visibility into the spend and the amount of money you're putting with the suppliers is super important, but visibility into what the relationships are like, visibility into the risk profile of some of your suppliers. How are you going to manage them? Would you say, Conrad, that should also form part of it? The visibility of your supply base and your supply chain.
Well, it's funny because the first priority in this is to have the data and get visibility. The very immediately after priority now is actually to focus in the data about what matters most. I mean, the data itself is massive in most cases and overwhelming. And so, we talk about segmenting suppliers. You absolutely need to segment the suppliers so that now you understand, where am I going to focus? You may have 500 or you might have, 50,000 suppliers. In any case, if you have 500, you don't have enough resources to go, do everything for all of those suppliers and everything that you can and should do, right? So to get out of reactive mode, you need to go through that exercise of looking at the data and deciding what to do. It kind of leads to a strategy, right? But that means you have to take the data and you have to make it actionable. And I think that segmentation does that. I mean, Natasha showed us a stakeholder map, and which is awesome, right? But we need to segment the suppliers as well. So then we step back and say, where are we going to focus and what are we going to do? Absolutely key to basic. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of data, a bunch of visualizations, you have knowledge, but turning that knowledge into action, I think, requires the segmentation that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I just want to add to that, Conrad, that traditionally procurement segments suppliers based on the spend. But that's not how legal segments suppliers. They segment them based on the risk.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not how stakeholders segment suppliers. They segment them based on criticality to their services. And that may not reflect in the risk or in, it will reflect in the risk, but may not necessarily reflect in the spend. So it is a role of procurement to kind of like create this 3-dimensional segmentation map to think about a supplier from this 3 perspective: the spend, the risk, and criticality for the business.
Yeah. So
I think
by the way, I mean, you're going to have people on your team that are like, I'm going to go talk to those stakeholders. What are we going to talk about? Well, take the list, take a proposal on, this is how our first cut at segmentation looks like. Who are the most important suppliers here? What do you think about that? Where do we get, so this is where the segmentation does require, I mean, we can't even sit in a vacuum and make those determinations about criticality of the business without talking to them, right? So making it actionable by, getting in and doing that segmentation in collaboration with those organizations that you're talking about. There's so much to do. There's so much to talk about. So, but I know that sometimes it's an excuse. Like, what are we going to talk about? There's tons to talk about because we're collaborating, to get this great value and result together.
Yeah. I love this 3D segmentation, Natasha. I think you've coined a new probably procurement buzzword or consulting buzzword, if you like. There's this idea of 3D segmentation, 4D segmentation, because you can segment across so many dimensions. And I think the ones that you mentioned is so important. And you're right. They're just not, they don't carry through, segmenting for risk is different from spend, it's different from how your stakeholders see. So I'd like to see more procurement teams do this multifaceted segmentation. Often they get stuck because they try to combine too many different lenses into.
Yeah.
But you don't need to
one of the greatest episodes of my partnership with legal was that when we build volume versus value analysis, and we looked at all number of the entire contract volume and we compare it with the value. And it actually allowed us to completely reposition how we use legal and procurement resources, because we spent 80% of our time and resources on the contracts that generated 20% of the value, just because there was so many of them. And we found a way what can be put on the POs, what can be put on kind of like just automated bidding, and what transactions can actually go through, like regardless of the spend. There was some categories of spend up to $1 million that we decided don't need the contracts because there's no risk associated with this type of goods or services.
So Natasha, when you say value, are you talking about value of investing the work, or
Value
like,
of the contract?
like
So
the dollar
volume of the
dollar
contract.
value, or what do you mean?
So how many contracts we between procurement and legal we produce that are under $50,000, under $100,000, under $150,000. So in 80% of contracts volume were under $150,000 of spend.
But what if you have some disguised risk with a supplier? It might not
That's
be a
why
legal
you're
risk.
partnering with legal, and legal know the risks associated with the types of services you buy.
Yeah, so you're segmenting the contracts, right? You're saying these are the where we're going to invest this partnership together. That's brilliant. It's really good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
absolutely.
one of the examples how to build close relationships with between procurement and legal, because the resources are finite for both organizations, and you just can't go after everything. So you have to determine what's important to the organization.